Hey, deserving listeners, it's time to continue watching the trial. Let's watch.
These items have been termed critical items. You're familiar with that concept?
Yes, I am.
All right. And I just want to ask you about a couple of the critical items. The first one is potential for aggression. This was deemed under your PAI a critical item. And it says, sometimes my temper explodes and I completely lose control.
Okay, I mean, this is interesting. I'm glad they're actually getting a little micro on the PAI, but it doesn't say that somehow Amber isn't telling the truth or wasn't reasonable in her statement that she was being abused. But it's also kind of cherry picking. The PAI, MMPI 2, there are so many things that you can look at. And that's why it takes an experienced psychologist to actually interpret these results. Because if you don't know what you're doing, there's so many random things like this on a test. Like it's natural to overemphasize the occasional indication of something going on. So for every one of these items of concern, you could probably point to a lot more evidence that there wasn't an indication of Amber Heard being the abusive individual. But, you know, it is interesting. I think what they're getting at is that she did agree with this statement as being a true statement for herself, that sometimes her temper explodes and she completely loses control. So I'm sure what Dr. Hughes will say is, yeah, that doesn't mean she wasn't abused. That doesn't mean she doesn't have PTSD. Victims of abuse absolutely could say that that was true for them, that they will lose their temper, because when you're being abused, when you're being controlled, when you're being dominated, sometimes you just lose control of your emotions and you get super, super angry. Not every victim will go through that, but I'm guessing that that's what she's going to get at. But, you know, it could be data that will sway the jury.
How did that potential for aggression bear on your analysis?
Well, there's a few things. Number one, certainly Ms. Heard reported to me that in her relationship that would happen. Her anger and her affect regulation would become impaired. Number two, you have to look at the total scales where that scale is not elevated, so it would not be a major cause of clinical concern.
Right, meaning that the physical aggression scale was not elevated, meaning that there's a lot of questions that feed into that scale. When you take all those answers together, it does not indicate potential for physical aggression. And, you know, while I'm on the topic, one of the things that I see as a modern phenomena is that people will get angry in public. They're yelling at a clerk at the convenience store, they're yelling at a police officer, or they're yelling at a teacher or something, and people bust out their phones, or a road rage incident, people will pick up their phones and film it, and then they push it on the internet and people will laugh at those individuals. And some of those people are perhaps morally laughable or ridiculable, but many times when I'm watching, I'm looking for signs of someone having a trauma reaction. Maybe it's PTSD, maybe it's something else, and sometimes that's what it looks to me. And I can't know because it's diagnosing from afar, of course, and I would never do that. But I think that for a lot of these people that are being ridiculed online, they, for whatever reason, are being triggered, and then they switch from their regular mode where they're a perfectly nice, regular person to being a very, very different person. You know, when we go through trauma, especially repeatedly, we develop this mechanism of fight or flight, freeze, appease, or faint. And one of the elements of that is to fight, right? So when you are, you know, think about Will Smith. I don't know, but one conceptualization of why he slapped Chris Rock is because he has disclosed in a book that as a child he witnessed his father abusing his mom a lot. And he might have been abused himself. But at the very least, he saw his mom being abused, and he obviously really loved his mom and felt as a young child that it was his responsibility to save his mom. And he felt ashamed of himself that he couldn't save his mom from his father, which of course is irrational. He was a, 7-year-old kid, 10-year-old kid. He isn't capable of doing that physically or any other way. So he did that, but kids will do that. They'll blame themselves for all sorts of things, unfortunately. And so he said, it's my fault, I'm ashamed of it, and I'm a coward. That was his takeaway from his childhood. And he has tremendous trauma around that. And it's follows him around, this voice in his head of like, you're a coward, you're a coward, you're a coward. Look what you did. You know, you don't stand up for people. You don't protect people. You just let her be abused. You know, what a piece of crap you are. You know, that voice is probably really quite strong. Then, and it doesn't justify the slap of Chris Rock at all, at all, at all. In the same way that when people are screaming at a convenience store clerk, it doesn't justify it, but it does explain it, and it gives us something to go off of in terms of trying to change that behavior in the individual. You can decide for yourself if you want to have sympathy for people like Will Smith and others, and so one possible hypothesis about Will Smith is Chris Rock says a joke about his wife, Jada Pinkett Smith, and then Will Smith is laughing at first. He's like, okay, whatever. Looks over, sees that she's upset about the joke, and it triggers him. It's not the same, right? It's not the same as watching your father, systematically abuse your mother, but it's reminiscent of that, and it triggers that trauma in the same way that when a war veteran comes back from war and associates helicopters or loud noises with imminent death or death around him or her or them, and then comes home and is walking down the street and there's a loud noise or there's a helicopter, and they become triggered and they feel as though they're right back there, and they might even have similar behaviors of fight or flight, freeze, appease, faint. And so for Will Smith, in that moment, it triggered him, and he took action that felt congruent with where he was at. And you could really tell, when he sits back down and he's screaming, that his body is not regulated. This wasn't like a calm choice that he made. His physiology was probably going through the roof. So my point is that I hope y'all, when you see these kinds of videos online, that, take a beat and think, is that person suffering? The other possibility is they're literally delusional and schizophrenic or something from either mental illness or drug-induced psychosis. There are cases like that. So just take a beat and think, is that person traumatized and they're reacting from that? Doesn't make it okay, but does that, because I feel like there are times when we just look at someone and assume that they go home and think, yep, that's exactly what I wanted to do in that situation. I screamed at a clerk for 15 minutes, the police showed up, and I was handcuffed and I resisted arrest. That's how I like to live my life. I'm guessing that a lot, if not most of those individuals in those videos later on are very, very remorseful and confused as to how that would have happened. Why did they do that? Because just imagine you are traumatized in various different ways, and then you are triggered and you're reacting. It doesn't make it okay. It does not make it okay, but you're reacting verbally and, maybe even aggressively. You're throwing things at the Kmart or whatever. The police show up and then they tackle you, hold you down, and restrain you. And yes, that needs to happen often, not always, but it often needs to happen if they're going to harm other people or they're breaking things. They should be restrained. But you can imagine to the traumatized individual that this would be even more triggering, right? They were already triggered by a clerk or a fellow customer that was in their way or seemingly violating their integrity to their space or whatever, or disrespecting them, and they get triggered, and then you physically hold them down, which could be absolutely emulative of what was going on when they were children. And I'm not saying that we just let them do whatever they want, but I'm just saying I think we need to understand that and hope maybe help those individuals to get the help that they need so that they actually can recover and they won't do this sort of thing again. And when they apologize the next day, that we don't assume that they meant to do those things, that they actually stand by those behaviors. I think sometimes people do, or they're just, apologizing because they know they're supposed to. And certainly there's a lot of examples, other motivations for these kinds of behavior, like racism and sexism. Think about, I can't remember her name, but the woman who was just randomly upset at a black guy who was in the park who was bird watching. She was walking her dog, and she gets on the phone and is like, there's a black man in the park and he's going to kill me, and she obviously is playing it up. And, I don't know, maybe there was something going on there mentally for her. I don't know. But given our society, it's not inconceivable that someone did wake up in the morning and had that potential, within their personality, regardless of trauma.
Number 3, she had 4 responses that she could say to this question. Mainly true, very true, mainly true, sometimes true or false. She chose sometimes true. So she's answering honestly about her experience.
Right. The other thing about this is that if she had not indicated at least sometimes true, then you would be suspicious that she was lying, because clearly in the recordings, I don't know how she would characterize it, but I would characterize it as she's very angry and not in control of herself in terms of even the audio recording we heard earlier. So the fact that she answered sometimes true to this indicates that she was taking the PAI seriously. So I just want to put it out there, and I hope that it's clear that I'm open to the data, and I'm also open to the idea that I'll never have an opinion as to whether or not Amber Heard was abused or not, or who's telling the truth. I might, but I might not. And that's the way my life goes in my world, in the clinical world. In reality, sometimes you're just like, I don't know. But I hope that y'all don't hate me for proposing both sides potentially having a valid argument. But, think what you want.
So it's sometimes true that sometimes my temper explodes. That's
Correct.
what you're testifying.
Correct.
All right. So you've talked a little bit about this concept called malingering. And there's one here for potential malingering. And this is another one of these critical item endorsements. Critical items means that these are serious pathology, right?
Well, as you can see, it says endorsement of these critical items is not in and of itself diagnostic.
Yeah. So it's cherry picking, of course. And if we look at this item, so this is trying, that this item, along with many others, is used to get at whether or not someone is malingering, meaning that they are faking a problem for secondary gain. Presumably PTSD is what I think the lawyer is getting at. And so there's a lot of items, and when you pull all those items together, there are a number of validity scales for PAI, and apparently none of them indicated that Amber Heard was either exaggerating or diminishing her symptoms or her issues. But one of the questions that you want to look at, I'm trying to think of when we would actually put a lot of weight on these issues. If someone was on the borderline of malingering, because these are all scales and there are cutoff points, and if someone was right on the line, you might say, like, well, are they malingering? And there were other indications maybe that they're malingering, like you just, in an interview with them, they seem to say things that were a little suspicious. You might look to this as what's going on. And according to research, this question can help in those judgment call, nuanced gray areas. The question is, I think I have 3 or 4 completely different personalities inside of me. So the idea, I think, is that a question like this for people who don't have dissociative identity disorder, for example, will answer true to this question, saying, yes, I do have 3 or 4 completely different personalities inside of me, because according to popular culture, they think that this indicates just general insanity, for example. Someone who's trying to come across like they're insane at the time of the crime, which these malingering tests are often critical for. They're trying to fake that they were insane at the time of the crime, because they think actually that to go to a psychiatric hospital somehow is better than going to prison, which maybe it is, but you can actually be detained much longer. So some people might mistakenly take this question as, if I want to fake something, I should answer yes to this. But having said all that, could someone answer true to this item because they interpret it a certain way? Like I was saying earlier about PTSD, someone might think of it and frame it and narrativize their experience as having different personalities, even though that's not the way we would language it clinically. And you'll hear people talk about this. They'll be like, oh yeah, I'm a completely different person when I'm drunk, or before coffee, I'm a completely different personality. And in our language, we wouldn't say that, because that's That's not how we use those words, but people will use those words sometimes. So could someone have, with PTSD or even a personality disorder, have an experience where it feels like they're completely different people given different circumstances? Absolutely. So the fact that she answered yes to this doesn't mean anything. And of course, you would look at the malingering scales to answer the question as to whether or not she's likely to be malingering. Having said that, could she have been malingering and she tricked the test? Yes, it happens all the time. So, these aren't hard scientific results.
So you need to review the content of the item, and that's how you make the determination. Is this something of clinical concern that you need to do more on?
The other reason why these items are often pulled out for a clinician to take note of is because there are so many questions. The program is designed to spit out certain questions to highlight, hey, you might want to take a look at this because they answered true to this question.
That she scored a 0 on that item. She said it's not something that's relevant for her at the time frame that the test was administered.
And these are all self-reports, right?
Correct.
And so she scored a 0 on doing something violent because you were so upset.
Correct.
See that language? You knew Ms. Heard to do violent things when she's upset.
This test specifies how often have you had these symptoms in the last 6 months?
Just in the last 6 months.
Right. So she is trying to assess whether or not someone has PTSD right now. And the questions are phrased, have you experienced this in the last 6 months? And so when she administered the test and she was doing the evaluation, it was well after her and Johnny Depp had split and had not seen each other. So when she answered the question, do I get violent sometimes as a result of being triggered? I can't remember the exact wording of the item. She said no, 0. And yeah, that makes sense. So this cross-examination. I mean, sometimes I wish... And I wonder, so there's two possibilities. Either one is that the lawyer is just trying to throw everything out there and hoping that something will stick to the jury. The other possibility is that the lawyer doesn't understand how these instruments work and thinks that they do understand.
6 months.
Correct.
All right. So she hadn't had them in the last 6 months.
Correct.
This test also asks and inquires about intentionally hurting yourself or cutting.
In the last 6 months.
Right.
Is the prompt.
All right. In the last 6 months.
Correct.
Had Ms. Heard previously indicated to you that she cut herself?
She indicated one time as a teenager in a reckless moment she did. It was stupid and I never did it again.
Interesting. We've heard also, I don't know if I included these clips, that there was a possibility that she suffered from an eating disorder, or a previous therapist had thought that she might have. The forensic psychologist is quick to dismiss all of that. But anyway, so I don't know what that means. But, well, I'm guessing the reason why at least the legal team would try to downplay that is because they're associated with personality disorders, namely borderline and histrionic. Mainly borderline, and they believe, probably accurately, that if the jury believes that Amber Heard has borderline, then they believe that Amber Heard is distorted and doesn't know what she's doing, which of course isn't true. Can a personality disorder create distortions? Yes, I've been over that. So we're learning that she reportedly cut once when she was a teenager and never did it again.
As with most things, I asked about the frequency of the behavior and had it ever occurred again.
All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.